Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to our webinar series organized by Kriya Lead. I am Swarnamalya Ganesh. I'm a practicing dance artist and a dance historian. I'm also assistant professor at Kriya University, the Division of Arts and Literature. LEAD at Kriya University is an action-oriented research center of IFMR Society that leverages the power of research, innovation, and co-creation to help solve complex and pressing challenges in development. Kriya University itself is a new liberal arts university in the horizon located at Sri City. And we have as our central focus interwoven understanding of porous boundaries in disciplinary education. We also look at the porous boundaries between academia and communities and their lived experiences. Therefore, it's a very purposeful synergy that brings Kriya's academic strength and vision and leads research strength together to look at certain solutions towards solving human, environment, societal problems. We aim big, and therefore we began with a project that really, I think, defines human existence today across the world, irrespective of which country you belong to and which development sector. Kriya Lead has recently begun a gender-based violence in public spaces project, which has been supported by Ford Foundation. At this juncture, I must thank and acknowledge the tremendous work behind putting this webinar together of my colleagues, Preeti Rao, Diksha Singh, and Archana Shekhar. A big shout out to our entire IT and communications team. Before I take you into today's webinar, I must give you a little bit of a background of what it is that we do, both at the project level as well as what we have tried to do with this webinar series. So the project itself, as the name suggests, is looking at the intersection of gender-based violence, but particularly in public spaces. So we were looking at shifting cultural norms and, statistically looking at what it is that we need to do in terms of policy, in terms of, working with the stakeholders, etc. But right at that juncture, we were brought to a grinding halt when the COVID happened. But what COVID has really thrown up for all of us is the understanding that the situation of emergency with regards to gender-based violence and gender inequalities and discrimination is a pandemic that we as a community and as a society and as a world itself have been fighting for far longer. It's a much bigger menace than Corona will ever be. So how have we learned to normalize gender-based discrimination? How have we learned to live with gender-based violence? Is it okay? Just yesterday, when we were talking to our very dynamic panel, one of them pointed out that every time any seminar or any conversation begins, we're always quoting a data about how 1 in every 3 women is facing some form of discrimination or violence. How long are we going to continue to quote these data? So the idea of this webinar was really to almost collide into our perception, our current position of what and where we are in terms of gender-based violence. In a way, we have moved concentrically inward, I would say, because we began at a very sort of a macro level with someone like Kamla Basinji, who brought the idea of feminist conversation and patriarchy head on, and she made us think and sit up in our chair. She said, hey, why are you calling this a pandemic problem? This is not a pandemic problem. This is the pandemic. And then from there, we moved a little bit inwards with, a 3 people, very eminent panel who discussed the legalities, the policies, the lack of infrastructure, the gaps really in trying to navigate through gender-based violence. As I was saying yesterday, we began with the idea of mitigating, but then we have expanded our scope and we've said, hey, we have to look at annihilation of gender-based violence. But it's a big vision with small inroads to make, very meaningful inroads to make. So in that progression inward, I think this panel today really brings it one step closer to coming towards the communities, the women, the grassroots so to speak. We have three young, eminent, dynamic people with us who are each working in their own ways with women particularly, but also at large gender, and looking at navigating through gender-based violence, not just in a generic way, but looking at it through the lens of space. And I think this is where we need to land, to look at space, to look at various spaces and the reframing of space itself, which has also been our preoccupation here. Before I introduce the first panelist, and the format of today is going to be very similar to our previous webinar. We have three panelists. I will introduce each one of them and request them to each address us and talk to us, following which we will have a Q&A, a panel discussion, so to speak, followed with questions. But keep your questions coming in through the Q&A box, and we have colleagues who are taking your questions, and we will have them discussed and answered. That's the format. But as I said, I think before I jump into today's, and I invite the three speakers, I just wanted to quickly share my screen here with three very powerful images, I thought, something that speaks right to this panel. Let me scroll. That's the second image. And that's the third. I shared these because these are from the photo series by a photojournalist and a traveler and a gender activist, Sanjukta Basu. And she had done this a few years ago, I think in 2011, if I'm not wrong. And it did look at gender-based violence in public spaces and sort of gender segregation really in public spaces. How intimidating are public spaces for women in particular, but generally genders other than the masculine gender? This is a question that we all ask sometimes to our own selves, but not something that we have collectively put enough thought, because spaces are still very much segregated. So the question really, the central question of today's conversation is really, who legitimately owns the public domain? And this public domain is not restricted anymore, especially thanks to COVID, but also pre-COVID, to public spaces in the public arena as such, but also digital spaces. So ideas of access, idea of privilege, idea of dominance, idea of stigmatization, and ideas of intimidation, power structures are all part of our conversation when we have to think about who legitimately owns public space. So everything from body language to perceived and normalized cultures to how do we really train our own minds to feel safe in public spaces are going to be the domain of today's conversation. I think it's a need of the hour conversation, and therefore we have three wonderful dynamic speakers with us to share their perspectives. I first would like to introduce Gopika Bashi. Gopika is the Asia campaigner with the worldwide Enough campaign at Oxfam International. She supports countries to plan and run campaigns that challenge and change widely accepted and harmful social norms that justify violence against women and girls. Gopika is an advisor for Frida, the Young Feminist Fund, currently serves on the panel of the Global Resilience Fund, and is on the board of Labour and Human Rights Organization, CVDEP India. A very accomplished young activist, thinker, researcher, and worker. We are very, very happy to have Gopika with us. Gopika, welcome, and thank you for joining this panel. Looking forward to hearing you.
Thank you so much for having me. And I always feel afraid when people call me accomplished because it freaks me out. Anyway, but thank you so much for your generous introduction. And I think just to start on some initial reflections around the question. It's a big question, and when you were mentioning in the beginning about data, the UN defined the violence against women during the pandemic as a shadow pandemic, And to be honest, as a gender justice advocate and campaigner, it comes as no surprise. We've been hearing these figures and seeing figures thrown at us for many, many years. And somehow these figures have sort of legitimized the problem. And so I think today I want to approach this more from the issue around narratives and how deeply patriarchy and patriarchal narratives are so deeply embedded in our ways of thinking. And so also challenge us a little bit in terms of how we look at what we define as pre-COVID and after COVID, which is going to be, the reality of our times now. And I think you very rightly put it that, these things have existed for a long time. So it's important for those of us who work on gender justice and violence to remind everyone that these are pre-existing conditions that we are living in. I think the danger of what COVID-19, the real particular risk that I see is that things going backwards, further backwards for women, girls, gender diverse people, and particularly gender diverse people who the gains have come so slowly over the last, few decades. So I just wanted to actually touch on a little bit of that. When we look at COVID-19 and even the global evidence, regional evidence, I think the closest we can learn from is humanitarian and disaster responses. Of course, it's not the same, and I think everyone in public health and humanitarian would realize that this sort of experience is not really anything we've seen in our lifetime. But my colleague, who works in sub-Saharan Africa, wrote an article recently about the Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone, and she actually talked about how the fact that during the Ebola outbreak, teenage pregnancies were on the rise because of increase in rape, and the fact that women were then blamed for the fact that they had no self-control. That was actually the word used, that they had no self-control. And actually policy reforms, long-term policy reforms were affected by that. So here I just wanted to take this example to illustrate how the gains that the feminist movement in the subcontinent have made over many, many decades have a huge risk of going back. And that's not just an issue of the government. And I know we can talk about the governmental and policies and advocacies, but how are those advocacy and policy messages, how are they created? They are created by a system, and I'm here to remind us of that system, which is normalizing certain exclusionary and patriarchal practices that we have come to normalize ourselves. So for me, what is the post-COVID world for women and girls? And I think this idea of public and private would be something great to unpack during this webinar, because I see a young girl doing TikTok videos from her home, maybe around COVID. She's teaching her amazing 1.5 million audience at home, but she steps out during the lockdown, maybe after hours, and gets harassed by the police. So in the sense, the very sense that we're talking about, that, home is, this idea also that there is only one narrative of violence, that only women in the home are being affected by COVID because the government is saying stay home, stay safe. So I also wanted to talk about some of those nuances that don't often get captured. And when we talk about violence, it is also domestic. It's usually domestic violence, and that is usually in the context of a heteronormative society where we have a husband, a wife, and a child. So let's also recognize that public and private have meant different things for different people. 2 days ago, an amazing young feminist, Nidhi Goyal, released a report here in India, speaking to a number of disability rights activists about the rights of women and girls with disability. And it's almost ironic that we have to keep having this conversation. And I myself am continuing to learn about how to unlearn so many norms, because they have been fighting long fights around access. And now we are in a situation where certain practices become normalized or are going to become normalized as a result of the pandemic. So I think it's important to recognize that we are going to be in a moment where we are going to, everyone is talking about new normals. And I think we need to also hold back from that. We need to hold back a little bit and say, actually, things are the same and possibly worse. Sorry to be the bleak person on the panel, but I think it's important for us to use this moment to remember how these things have been normalized, and for us to not continuously see patriarchy as something out there, as something different. And it requires a lot of shifting in terms of whether it's social norm change, whether it's changing our individuals' attitudes and behavior, which is not easy. I guess that's where sort of my reflection is positioned. And I think it comes from, even the campaigning that we do, we start from a place where we know that there is prevalence. So let's move beyond the prevalence rates. Let's start having the hard conversations, which are around how is COVID-19 actually negatively affecting the access that women and girls and gender diverse people don't have in normal times. And I think that's a real sort of starting point where we need to be in terms of this conversation. And I think the last thing I just wanted to say about how do we shift social norms? I think that is like the big question that everyone is talking, oh, how do we change things? I don't think that it's the responsibility of a single organization or human being. And I think it's definitely not just the responsibility of those of us who call ourselves gender justice activists. It is a responsibility of everyone. And that comes when we understand that how have things changed in the past? We know certain things were normal in the past and they're not normal anymore. And that is because we have worked over time to change those norms. And I think it's super important to recognize that changing social norms is a long-term process, and we shouldn't let COVID-19 be the moment where we go back on those games. So yeah, I think I'll stop there because I might have run out of time.
Thank you very much for those, I think, very thought-provoking opening remarks. And I think one of the things that you have said has, I think, resonated also with the series itself, the webinar, is that in the previous session, as I said, the legal experts and the advocates, gender advocates who had joined us, pinpointed the lacuna in the system, in the policy, so to speak, that we were in a position of looking at the gaps there. But then where is the onus? Is it only with the policy? You have sort of brought it back to focus it on also the people. And, and how do we as advocates of policies as well, and as people, as women, as participants in this, in the socializing process, how do we contribute? That is the big question for sure. And thank you for bringing so many very relevant points for us to ponder upon and further discuss. Our next speaker is Thirupurasundari Sevvel. And I must begin by saying that Thirupurasundari is a very good friend of mine, but she's a wonderful architect and an urban planner who runs Studio Conclave, an architectural consultant, and Nam Veedu, Nam Ooru, Nam Kadai is an initiative that stems from her passion for storytelling and education. For this platform, Thirupurasundari curates stories on social issues and uses her expertise as material restorer and conversationist to document traditional techniques and practices of design. What Thirupurasundari can effectively bring to this conversation, I believe, is this idea of space itself. I mean, she's also a gender advocate, so she will also throw light on the gender aspect, but the idea of space and how do we design space, not just in urban planning, but is gender at all on the agenda when any planning is done, whether rural or urban or anywhere? Gender safety, gender access. In the 3 photographs that I shared, I just realized when I saw those photographs that public spaces are tremendously intimidating for women. I recall reading this book called Why Loiter a few years ago. That really, again, sort of frames this entire idea of spaces may be created, but are women really allowed to access those spaces? So what is it? What is that? What are those few steps between creating a space and then now allowing or making sure that a woman has access to those spaces? Thirupurasundari, we are looking forward to listening to you. Welcome to the panel.
Thank you, Swarnamalya, for the introduction. Like the other panelists said, you gave an overwhelming introduction. So let me break down space or the entire discussion into 3 parts. When we look at something happening in an urban space, you have the space, as in the physical space. Then you have the activity, what is going to happen there, and third one are people. Where does gender come in these three aspects? It is easy to understand or break down any space in these aspects. For example, let's look at the activity. Is an activity gender specific? In that case, if you say there are these norms which says that, okay, these are men related activities, these are women related activities, or these are activities which women should not do. So the problem is there in activities, and then let's come to people. Are we, or should I say, are women allowed to certain spaces? Are we allowed to? Why? So in the triangle, if you look at space, people, and activity like a triangle, the activity, yes, there is a problem or bias here. In people, the conditioning. I'm not telling they are doing that, but they are conditioned for a pattern. They are used to that pattern. People includes everyone, right? People who are telling not to go, people who are telling you have to use, everyone. So this, like the top portion of the triangle brain space, is highly affected because of that. So when we talk about gendered spaces, is a space gendered? It is because of the activity, the mindsets, and the people, and then that kind of culminates in how a space. The pictures you showed exactly reflect the same. So I would like to use this particular word. It's kind of a common word when we talk about women-centered space. Something called spatial justice. So spatial justice is something when what makes a person not to use a space. So let's keep this triangle in mind, okay? And then there is a park, and someone gets down in a bus stop opposite to the park. And why does someone have to say, okay, this is not a safe bus stop for me, let me get down 2 bus stops later, that is comfortable for me, or let me get down 1 bus stop earlier and just walk. So what makes them make these choices? So again, another 5. So if this is the triangle, the next one is like a star, okay? 5-ended star. The first point is lighting. Am I able to see which is my destination? Am I able to see which is my end point? And like a 5-ended star, one is my lighting. Second one is my pathway. Is my pathway defined? Do I know how to maneuver and go? And third one is accessibility. Is there people is this place somewhat familiar to me? Okay. And the fourth point of that star is signages and boards. Do I see where I have to go? See, I know there is a path. I know there is an access. How do I know? But the fifth point of the star is very important. What makes a women use a public space? One important factor is other women using the space. When you see more women using the space, when you see a lot of others using the space, you really are comfortable to go. You are like, oh, hey, hi, there are this group of people I want to talk. And a very good, interesting example of this is you have these roadside chat shops in Chennai, chat shops, and then or roadside pani puri shops or tea kadais, which is my favorite. You can see predominantly men there. Okay, but there would be few tea shops. Specifically, I'll talk about Ananagar since that was a part of our research. There are totally around 62 tea kadais in Ananagar, and there are 5 to 6 where you can see a lot of women because they are near women colleges, and predominantly women go there. And when a bunch of women are already there, and then that becomes a safe, not a safe place, that is identified as a, okay, this, I can go to this tea shop, I can go to this place. So the star, all the other 4 parts of the point of the star may be a design mindset, but the fifth one, women, seeing women in a space will make other women come forward. You can put them under any category. They may be mothers, sisters, friends, or it could be anybody. It is like going to a city and you see someone who is familiar to you and saying hi. And then you see a color which is familiar to you. And then you see someone wearing the same color dress as you. That makes you feel like, oh, that's a thing. So it is a very humane thing to see that. So how do we arrive at the spatial justice, or how do we arrive at it? So there are in terms of planning. Uh, if we again break it down, it is like what is the who is going to use that space, or second one is in terms of designing a public space, who is going to design that place, second who is going to use it, or the set of activities in the place. This is like the common design brief or the common ideology with which any designer or a space planner works or get into. But what we don't think about is uh, what could have been the usage of space? Who were all people who had denied the space? What is the user group which has not been used to this place? So I think in that initial framing of designing a public space, if these things of okay, this is there, this is what has been happening, but who are the set of people who are denied this access, denied that space? So if we look at designing of any public space at that point of view, then things will change drastically and the design outcome will be phenomenal. A very small story which we generally tell schools and teachers to talk about children are there is a tree, and then there is a seating around the tree, and then there is a playground. Generally, the male children are playing in the ground and girl children are sitting here. And is this the right way? Because we have two exclusive space, one for women, one, and then they kind of swap. They go here, they come here. Is it the right way to do? We have exclusive space for women, men, and then we have time, exclusive time for men, exclusive time for women. Is this going to work? No. Because inclusive is what which will work. Coexisting. And then I think that understanding of space will happen why people don't use that space. Generally, we try to understand a space or a city or a building by, okay, these are the set of activities happening, but we should also understand why certain activities are not happening, why certain people are not getting access to it. So it can be very personal also. For example, when I was studying college, the first thing my seniors told me was, don't take this bus number from your place to that your college. Take the second bus number, because that conductor is very friendly and he makes sure that someone comes near you, he'll give a shout, and then you can be safe. This is something which didn't seem very important at that time. I was like, why is she saying that? And then bus users, common bus users, you would have heard if you are a first time user. For me, when I was first day of college, I went by car, and then after a year or something, when I had to go with a friend, the first thing she told me was, put your backpack behind, because no one can come. This is we should stop finding strategies to protect ourselves, and then otherwise to find how it cannot happen. I think these are two examples, but these are n number of advices and different points which we give. So why I mentioned about that particular bus and conductor was very simple. One simple voice counts for a longer run. There is just one person needed to say no, and then that one voice really helps. And coming back to the space dynamics of it, designing of public buses, we are talking like as in space, it's not just urban space. How is our bus stands? How are our bus public transport system? It's everything into it. And to sum it up, I think I already overshoot that. The main part of it is lighting. Lighting plays a major role. Second one is, if you know the clear end of your path, you're very comfortable in a space. It's not just for safety, it's not just women based also, even for men this applies. You a clear lighting in or very simple, the lower level of a building, right? It's called the plinth level, and then the ground floor, and then the first floor. The plinth and the ground floor just will be like 10%. The plinth level will be just 10% of your building structure. But if that is very comfortably designed, or if it is very welcoming, that will make 90% more number of people to use that space. Imagine the cafeterias in France. Why is it, or any European country, you see this corner cafeterias? What is making people to get attracted to that place? Very simple, opening out your spaces. And then another point I wanted to touch upon were toilets, public toilets. If we have to have access to public spaces, public toilets are to be designed in keeping in mind that we will be using the toilet, not that someone else is going to use the toilet. It should be designed in a comfortable way, and also it is right time to talk about changing rooms, because that again, changing rooms for women, or and also for men, drivers, and then there is this complaint we talk about bus drivers and car drivers. They're not clean, they're not, but do we have change rooms for them? Are there any spaces? Same thing with when we spoke to a couple of auto driver women, they told the same thing also. We don't have toilets, we don't have change rooms. So this is like a overall problem. But in terms of public spaces, a very small thing like public lights, lighting and access, and seeing a clear-cut vision will clear. So I think what we should think of achieving is spatial justice as well, because it's not just women. A city, you can't say this is a safe city, but not for women. If a food doesn't have salt, it doesn't have salt. It can't be for one person or the other person. So if it's not safe for women, it's not safe for anybody. So I think, that's the point I would make.
Thank you so much, TS. I think you have brought some very, very important points for us to connect with what Gopika had begun by saying, you know, how do we take the onus? How does the society really start looking at these acculturation practices? You know, some of the things that you said, you know, as you were speaking, I was thinking of the idea of the ladies only bus, you know, and the women only segregated spaces. Are they by themselves safe is one of the points that you raise. And how do women feel safe enough to even access those spaces? For example, even if you take a ladies bus, for example, when you get off, you need to get off into a world that is inhabited by both men, women, and others, right? So how do you really negotiate that space is one of the things that you said. And I think what you also say is, you know, and I remember that, you know, when it comes to planning of spaces and spatial justice, as you were saying, when it comes to the idea of rural space planning, and sort of breaking open barriers in a rural atmosphere, you know, in public spaces particularly, not just rural, actually this is as true to urban spaces as it is to rural. The tremendous amount of onus lies in the cultural interventions that people are part of, right? You know, a girl who is beaten in public space by her family or her husband, when there is a domestic violence that happens on the road, right? You know, those spaces are really blurred. And you know, when I remember distinctly once when I saw a young girl being beaten up by her boyfriend outside my house, and I went to rescue her, and the people near me, their neighbors from the neighborhood, said, do you know this girl that stands in the tea shop there and she's constantly just, you know, like smoking and having a cup of tea, she deserves it. This is the mindset, right? And I was utterly shocked. This was 20 years ago, and I was really young myself, and I was really shocked by the response of the public, not the event itself, right? So I think there's a lot of culture that needs to be reinvestigated if we are moving towards spatial justice. And when we speak about space and spatial justice and the idea of loitering and and women being part of spaces beyond purposefulness, I think what today comes to mind is the digital space. Why do we have to be on social media? Why do you have to put yourself out there? And why do you have to invite violence upon you? Are some of the usual questions that women encounter when they even go to, say, file a complaint or to register, you know, a form of violence that's been perpetrated on them. The digital space is a rift with so much violence and so much lack of safety, really. And to speak about that, and to bring to this conversation a variety of her diverse engagements with communities, we have next Radhika Radhakrishnan. Radhika Radhakrishnan is a researcher at the Internet Democracy Project, studying the intersections of gender, sexuality, technology, and governance. She has a master's in women's studies from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Radhika, I think this conversation has very sort of organically moved into looking at spaces beyond the public space, but still considered, or at least looked at as public spaces, the digital space and beyond. Welcome to the panel.
Thanks, Swarnamalya, for the introduction, and also to Gopika and Thirupurasundari for really sort of making my work a lot easier by laying out a lot of these foundational questions in a really nice manner. I think you're right that the sort of, the blurring of the spaces that you are referring to is something that is also observed when we actually talk about the digital, because to be really fair, like putting the digital as like a separate space outside of the offline space is not really how it's experienced in our everyday lives, because we really observe the online and the so-called offline spaces to be more of a continuum that sort of, melds into each other. That's hopefully something that I'll also sort of speak more about in today's conversation. For the purpose of my opening remarks, I think I want to focus on what would be the elephant in the room, in the sense of how COVID-19 is really affecting some of these spaces, and especially the digital spaces. So at the Internet Democracy Project, currently I'm focusing on a particular research project that's looking at surveillance for marginalized communities in India during COVID-19, with a focus on technology-enabled surveillance. And violence and surveillance really go hand in hand, because, at the end of the day, violence is like a form of surveillance. It's one of the consequences of surveillance when women sort of, as you were referring to earlier, move outside of the spaces that they're allowed to be a part of. So that's something that we're seeing coming across as quite a prominent theme within the research. And even like taking the idea of women to a more intersectional sense, so not just necessarily women, but people across intersectional identities of at the margins of sexuality, caste, class, religion. So I've been for the research speaking to a lot of women who have been facing these sort of experiences, this kind of violence, surveillance during COVID-19. So, talking to ASHA workers, migrants, Muslim women, sex workers, trans queer women, and we see that the theme of violence need not specifically be as physical or sexual violence itself, but in a lot more sort of broader senses, what are the various kinds of violence that are really being observed right now during COVID. And to center the digital in this, we're noticing that currently during COVID-19, offline modes of communication, more interpersonal levels of communication have really broken down, especially during the lockdown period, where people are becoming more increasingly dependent upon digital spaces for communication that would otherwise not have been so sort of prominent as the first approach. And what this has done is it's sort of created a lot of problems, especially for women, especially for trans queer persons, in terms of access and mobility. So I think I'll focus my opening remarks specifically around what these kinds of problems are that we're seeing have come out. And a lot of these insights, all of these insights are entirely based on, experiences of people that they're having in their everyday life. So very grateful to all the people who've spoken to me and shared these experiences with me. To contextualize that, as we know, there is a very stark gendered digital divide in the country, where significantly fewer women have access to mobile phones, access to the internet. And even if you do have access to these devices, it's not necessarily what you would call meaningful access, meaning, you don't have autonomy over that access. Usually that phone is shared in the family. So women are what are typically known as phone borrowers. So they don't have complete control over that particular device, or they may not have the money to recharge their internet packs every month. So even if you have that device, how meaningful is it for you to be actually able to use that device for giving you the benefits that the internet is sort of famed for democratizing and giving, so that is something to really contextualize. But even beyond the digital divide, there is a question of lack of privacy that a lot of women face. So if I'm a woman and I have access to a phone, let's say, but if I don't have access to, even for instance, be speaking, like if I don't have access to the privacy to be able to sit in a room of my own and say these things on this webinar, then there is not a lot of meaning to me having access to that internet and that device in the first place. So access to sort of physical privacy is also very much embedded within that digital gender divide. And now what has happened during COVID-19 is there are, well, a lot of things have happened during COVID-19 for this, but I'll sort of try to focus on two things here. One is that, of course, we're seeing a rising number of cases with respect to violence within the family, within the space of the family. And when you put this in the context of the digital, what happens is that right now, because domestic violence cases are sort of, increasing in a sense, because a lot of times women would have had some kind of recourse to spaces outside of the family, or they would not be locked in with abusive families day in and day out. These cases seem to be on the rise. And now what's happened is, because you cannot physically go to a police station to make a complaint, you're really reliant on that telephone, you're reliant on that internet connection to be able to even report this kind of violence, right? And now what happens is, now when you put in this digital gender divide into the picture, you realize that a lot of the women's rights organizations we spoke to, such as Ali, Point of View, they mentioned that because women's phones are often shared within the family, they are really feeling scared of calling up a helpline, for example, because they're scared of leaving behind traces of the number that they've dialed on a borrowed phone that actually belongs to their husbands or their fathers, etc. So because of this, they're not able to really get help the way they would have otherwise probably done. And even if women do have access to phones, because they don't have the space to sort of speak freely on the phone, on one hand, this means it's harder to report that violence, but on the other hand, this lack of privacy itself has become a trigger for violence, because a lot of families are now thinking, what is she doing on the phone? Whom is she talking to? Why does she need the phone? And this itself has become sort of a newer trigger for violence, where women are facing violence in their physical spaces because of their attempts at accessing the digital. So in that sense, you can sort of see that these, spaces again sort of meld and blur into each other. But also in terms of beyond just physical or sexual violence, we also see that like a lot of women are facing financial losses, for example, as a result of a lot of these factors. So for instance, a lot of sex workers, they usually have two SIM cards, right? One SIM card they use for their personal use, and then one SIM card they use for their professional use, because the work is so stigmatized that they don't want all the communications happening on one device. They don't want their families to find out that these are communications they're having in the first place. So as a result of this, what ends up happening is that now during COVID, because they are sort of stuck in that family within the household, they're not able to keep in touch with their clients the way they would otherwise have done. And as a result of that, they are facing financial losses because they are not able to continue work the way they otherwise would have. Now, some sex workers said that they are using mobile phones and digital payment methods to provide video services, for example, to clients. But a lot of other sex workers I spoke to, they said that not a lot of sex workers, especially like trans sex workers, may not even have the digital literacy to be able to access something like Google Pay or Phone Pay to receive these kinds of payments. So, not having access to the phone there is also translating into a direct loss of livelihood for a lot of people. And also because these are already vulnerable groups, they're not being covered under the state for a lot of the social protection schemes that are being put out. So in a lot of these senses, like, you can see how these spaces meld into each other, they blur, as you said, and they really sort of, they're layering one over the other. And that distinction between, like, this is the digital, these are harms in the digital, this is the physical, these are harms in the physical, does not really exist when it comes to how it's experienced at the end of the day by each people, and definitely much more heightened for people at the margins.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much. I think you have really sort of brought this conversation to where it needs to go, meaning that, you know, we are looking at the reframing of public spaces as inclusive of digital space, because today the idea of public engagement is essentially online, whether it's during COVID or post-COVID. I think this is a reality that all of us need to understand. And you also spoke about the nexus between surveillance and violence. That's really where I want to sort of also begin to also sort of pose to you this question of, how is that, is there a reverse nexus? Meaning, can the idea, or can the, access to digital spaces and to devices and the presence of genders, different genders on digital platforms, does it also increase their vulnerability? Right? We were talking about lack of access, in terms of them not being able to access devices to be able to, reach across and speak about their difficult times vis-a-vis gender-based violence. But what I'm trying to ask is, for example, the boys' locker room issue, right? The whole idea that there are vulnerable young people out there for whom the digital space is a reality, and this is part of their socializing process today, because schools and colleges are their entire education system is happening on the digital space. So have you also been looking at what is that nexus, and and how does culture play a role in that? Of course, definitely a huge role, but I'd like to hear from you, and we'll begin there discussion, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question also. And I think that also like takes us back a bit more to the fundamentals. And, you were mentioning why loiter earlier. And like, even if we start there, because I think that's quite foundational to understanding how this plays out. The power hierarchies that we're noticing in the physical spaces, in what even Gopika and Thirupurasundari said earlier, these same sort of power hierarchies and relations, social norms, are also observed on digital spaces. So my identity at the intersections of gender, caste, class, religion, ability, all of these determine my experience of the digital as well. So even though, the digital has this tag of being like this democratizing space where you can leave behind all your identities and be this liberated, anonymous person online, that's never usually the experience of people in the digital, because it's not free from those hierarchies. And the access issue is actually kind of crucial to understanding that through space, because, within this sort of, there is this dominant heteronormative understanding that what is traditionally considered the public space is usually the domain of men. And so women have a harder time accessing that kind of space. And if you're a private domestic woman, that's when you're considered a good woman. If you're a public woman, or someone who is out in the public for, as they say, no clear respectable purpose, then you're considered a bad woman, or someone along the lines of a sex worker, because that is stigmatized bad work in society traditionally. So what happens is that because of this current hierarchization, it's harder for women to access any kind of a public space. And the online space is considered a form of a public space. And as a result of this, women are supposed to follow the same social norms in digital spaces as they do in otherwise, offline physical spaces. So in the offline physical space, women are not supposed to speak loudly. They're not supposed to wear a particular kinds of clothes. In the digital space, you're not supposed to upload pictures of you wearing certain kinds of clothes. You're not supposed to be very activisty and loud. So the same kinds of expectations traverse into the digital. And I think that is where surveillance comes in, because surveillance then becomes a form of controlling women's actions, of saying that you can't do certain things, and those things are determined by your identity. So if you're a woman, you can't do all of these things. And if you do those things, that's where violence comes in. So violence then becomes a form of punishment for doing the things that you're not allowed to do. And that is very much true of the digital spaces themselves as well. That's why you see online violence really heightened for, let's say, trans queer women, Dalit women, Muslim women, because they are considered to deviate from those social expectations of what women should be doing a lot more in a lot of these spaces, because that space is supposed to be a space that they should not even technically be there according to traditional expectations. So because of a lot of these issues, I think that's where surveillance really connects with violence and comes together in the digital space.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a very important point, and it goes right back to, again, I think acculturation that Gopika was mentioning at the beginning, and that's sort of at the heart of what she does as well. Gopika, would you like to come in on the project that you do with the Global Resilience Fund and the Enough campaign, and really the work that you do with women's groups and communities?
Thank you. And I was nodding vociferously at what Radhika was saying, because I relate a lot to this idea of normalization, and also around the digital. When we speak about the digital, I think it's very much part of our everyday lives. And there are researchers and feminist theorists who are talking about our digital bodies and lives as one, because now there is no difference between both. We have sort of melted, our physical body is sort of melted into our technological body. So and how that works. But yeah, I wanted to, it brings me to actually something very COVID specific, which is the kind of messaging that we are seeing now around domestic violence and COVID-19. And I want to sort of challenge a little bit of an idea through, say, how the Enough campaign and how countries who are working on really challenging social norms have looked at this. So I'll give you a simple example. You might have seen a lot of campaigns about, how women are working so hard at home now, and, men should really help them out. And, you guys, you better help clean. And, here are some tips on how to clean. And I want to talk a little bit about the problematic messages of campaigns that try and advocate for gender equality. And I think this is where social norms come about, because I think in the idea of changing gender perspectives, we also let the patriarchy take over, and we also don't look at the underlying social norms. So we, in a sense, reinforce the patriarchy through that. And that's something that the campaign really looks at doing, is seeing, okay, where is our starting point? Our starting point is that historically and structurally, women's sphere have been at the home and caretakers. So if we're talking about equality in the home, then when we're crafting campaigns that look at sharing work, let us not look at it as something great and champion men for doing it. And, I might receive some trolling for this, but when we start from the assumption that work, care work, and unpaid work is the equal responsibility of men, women, anyone, trans, gender diverse, queer people, children, then we reach a very different message, which is that it is actually a basic expectation of equality that requires households to function normally. And the issue here is that when we look at this kind of messaging that says that puts men, actually cisgendered men, at the center, we actually take away from the fact that what is problematic here is the fact that during COVID-19, women are being faced with unjust violations of their human rights, basically. And I think we sugarcoat it a lot. And I think that's something that countries in South Asia, specifically around the Enough campaign, also thinking through how we can message with very deeply rooted feminist messaging, which goes beyond the sort of traditional pop gender stuff which we're seeing out there. And I think it's very sort of easy to slip into that, because when we see messaging like that, it relates to us. You know, you may have seen Share the Load from Ariel. Those guys are putting all their money into advertising now, and none of us actually question the underlying message of that. And so this is why it's really important to have the real feminist perspective that really looks at the underlying patriarchal norms when we're talking about campaigning against gender-based violence. The other thing that I want to talk about is how we have connected this idea of unpaid care work at home to violence. Actually, what people are not realizing is that when women don't take on these functions at work, I think Radhika talked a little bit about this, is violence as a form of punishment. And so it's not just a happy picture of you should help your wife. It is the idea that that cisgendered men who are in heterosexual relationships feel a sense of entitlement towards controlling women's lives and bodies. And I think once we, you know, it's very complicated when a feminist talks about it, but actually it is very simple to be able to translate some of those concepts into campaigns. And the other thing that we're seeing coming out of the COVID-19 situation is actually blaming women for the pandemic and also blaming LGBTQ communities. We've seen in some countries in South Asia, the government has actually blamed certain communities. We've seen in India that this has happened with religious minorities. And usually when certain minorities are being targeted, who actually gets impacted the most? It is the women, it is the marginalized gender groups within those communities who face the backlash from the public as well. So I think that's a really interesting point that I wanted to put out. And the last thing I want to say about the Global Resilience Fund is that, you know, I'm part of a panel that looks at COVID-19 relief for young women and girl-led groups who are responding to COVID. And I have to say, like, this is where the solutions are for me. For me, it's really about how are young people really innovating to find solutions and really keep challenging and pushing back against these norms. And I think that's really where the goal is. It's not just online, but we're seeing applications from young women from extremely marginalized communities doing labor, and they're going out with cycles and getting things done. I mean, the way they are occupying space, even in what is so-called like a lockdown situation, has been really inspiring actually to see how people have been able to challenge this. And I think that really comes from a space of when you face marginalization, and I think any person who has faced marginalization in life would know that you know how to respond, and you need to, it's sort of a reflex action. And I think any woman would be able to sort of identify with this. The reflex action is, how do I then go out and navigate? And so I also think that when we talk about safety, I also feel that safety is a problematic concept, because it implies that we are all unsafe, and it takes away the power from us to really say, like, let's occupy, let's challenge, let's smash things. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
I think that's very well put. In fact, the thing that inspired us in the previous panel earlier, when the second webinar, was also some of these stories. Despite all the bleakness of the gaps in infrastructure, etc., some of these stories of resilience that came out of, women from whom you would otherwise think, it's not possible for them to fend for themselves. But you're right, every woman and everybody, actually, every human has that instinct. And I think women as marginalized communities, definitely they find various ways to be very resilient. And thank you for bringing that. And I think one another point that you made that really is very important for us to think about is how not to glorify these trophy moments in patriarchy, right? And I really liked the very nuanced way in which you enunciated the idea of these so-called culture paradigm shifting campaigns. So we need to really rethink and be very nuanced in whether we are reinforcing patriarchy in some way by making it. I think that's a very, very important point, because very often we make it look like it's a trophy that they have won, and and therefore it's a moment. It's almost like a Kodak moment. They do it and they go back to everyday life. So how do we make it part of their culture? How do we, so to that extent, I think now TPS will, you have, you spoke about initially in your opening comments about how to make spaces less intimidating and more safe for women, right? I mean, you spoke about public spaces, you spoke about lighting, you spoke about the 5 edges of a star, which are very important, I think, right? But also considering that, women need to occupy spaces and are already occupying spaces, right? So how do we make, as Gopika was speaking, how do we blur, and Radhika, in many senses, we were speaking about blurring of the public and private space, and blurring of these gendered spaces. So one is to make it less intimidating, but they're already there. The spaces are already occupied, right? Whenever you're beaten into submission, you retreat a little bit, but then you're right there because you need to, like Gopika was saying, you need to fend for yourself. You need to find ways to negotiate and navigate and move on. So how does planning really come into this in terms of like renegotiating space to make it much more easier? I mean, women are resilient, but how do we, and not just women, I think the next round of conversations between us, maybe we should take it beyond to other genders as well. It's very important for us to have that.
Yes. When she was talking about resilient women and being occupying spaces, I got reminded of a work which we did with women working in fish market and then a flower market. And then we were just talking, and she was just talking to me in a very, very, very soft voice. And that was probably morning 5:30 to 6 o'clock. And then she was talking to us, and then she said, okay, in half an hour, clients will come. You just sit next to me. And then she had this loudest voice of selling voice of fish. And you should have seen the entire market was silent with her voice, whatever she had and the price. And then we were just thinking, she had a very low tone voice. What makes it? And then we were having lunch, and then she was serving us. She said, if I would have used my actual voice here, they would try to how do I say, overpower that voice or give me a more powered voice. So I started using this, and this is not a one-off experience. This happened when we were working with the flower markets as well. So when she was talking, this was going in my mind. And if you look at few of them in the markets, and then a couple of women are here, and then there is someone trying to do some mischief to some women there, the first voice will be from one woman here, and then 10 of them give that sound, and that make sure that situation is kind of caught on. And this is, in terms of safety and all that, is occupying that space. No, this is one way of doing that. You can find these pockets in every other market. You can find it outside temples. You can find it in smaller markets. So that is one reflection I wanted to, that was a very good example what she said, and I got reminded of that. And coming back to planning, when we talk about occupying spaces, like let's take on the street, let's take on these spaces and all that. There are two kinds, like the word loitering which you use. If the woman is professionally going to a work, or if she is going for learning something, if she is going to buy something, if she is going to teach someone, all these are considered okay. But then if it comes to like loitering, okay, or if I have to put it in parts, like going for a movie, going for a shopping for herself, going to a nightclub, or going to a party, and you can put everything in under one window, or hosting a party itself. So this is looked at what, okay, these things are okay. Women who do these set of things can go out at any time, and this set of tasks cannot go out. So I
that's
think
exactly what I said. The example that I was giving you, right? The fact that she was a journalist and she would stand at the tea shop, somehow, somehow everybody felt like it was okay for her to experience violence.
Yeah, and also
she was not vulnerable.
Yes, exactly. They feel that, okay, you do these set of things, but if you look at statistics and all, it is equal. It happens to both the sets of women. It is not that only this. Even now when a news flashes in the TV, I think the mindset change comes from the family as well. If there is a case about rape or any molestation, anything coming on, the first question would be, where would the girl have gone? What was she wearing? And we would say, no, our urban scenario, no one talks like that. Everyone talks like that. And that normalization kind of comes down to what she wears or what happens. So in terms of public spaces, the thing is, the spaces for this leisure, the spaces for fun also are to be done. Not just spaces which are professional, focusing on that. Like I spoke about toilets and changing room and all that. The spaces for leisure also have to be taken into account. Like, for example, the Marina Beach or the Besanagar Beach, or when we talk about Broken Bridge, whenever we talk about Broken Bridge, we talk about, okay, you have to go with a bunch of your friends to be safer. So on the other side, what do we have to do to make it better? So I think it is not just you have to go out on a purpose. There is that leisure angle. And this comes from the mindset of, okay, they are caregivers. Primarily, they have to take care of everything. They have to do work, but they are inside that bubble. So only when they come out of the bubble, they get into trouble. And I think that is one line I wanted
definitely.
to add.
No, I think I think these are conversations that need to really take into consideration the various segments of demographics we have.
Definitely,
Urban,
yes.
rural, all of that. We have quite a few hands that have been raised and a few questions in the Q&A
Yes.
box. But before we move there, let me ask one final question, and a quick response from the three panelists. Since all the three of you are in your own ways, working with, various stages of planning and implementation and advocacy, what is the one thing that you think can be a good pointer towards collaborative interface between, say, a research program and, implementation? How do we share knowledge and best practices? I mean, do you have, one of the things that Gopika just mentioned about, rethinking of campaigns to look at them through a nuanced, a patriarchal lens, I think is definitely one important thing that we need to do. But other than that, can you give us a quick pointer, one each of you, and then we'll move on to some of the questions, because it's 6-7 on the clock, and let's get the questions in.
One thing is to understand why, more research on why certain places are not used. There should be more research on, because only that outcome of that research will give way to more projects or more planning aspects on why certain, the time and all that, specific project specific, place specific, which can come down to a bus stand, to a shopping mall, to anywhere. So that kind of pointers will help in designing more efficient spaces. Yeah, more researches on that line, why places are not used.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
Gopika or Radhika, both of you actually?
Yeah, so if I may go next, if that's okay with Gopika.
Absolutely.
Since we're talking about blurring, I think one important sort of takeaway should be that there's another kind of blurring that's really important to talk about, and that's the blurring between our bodies and our data. That's something also that we're working on at the Internet Democracy Project. Because when we hear women talk about violence online, it's very rare to hear them talk about it in terms of data privacy or harms to the information that's been leaked. If like my images have been leaked online, you're going to hear women talk about it in terms of what they are experiencing, like fear, stigma. And I think therefore that sort of a blurring is really observed, where data is not actually a separate resource that's just out there for our use. But that is how a lot of programs, especially policies, currently view online violence and data. That's why platforms such as Twitter are more likely to take action against a post or a violation of copyright infringement rather than online violence, because online violence is not seen as something that's directly affecting my body. It's seen as something that's directly affecting my online profile, which is seen as a different part than my body. And I think blurring those lines and understanding that data of mine, that image of mine that's online, is also an extension of my identity. It's an extension of my body, is I think a step towards sort of bringing up that urgency that online violence is a form of violence that affects women even within, even in our physical spaces, and that those spaces and those two concepts are not that separate as they are made out to be, because you always hear like data is the new oil, this data is a resource. And I think we need to get rid of that idea and bring in that feminist notion of data being embodied as something that we experience in our everyday life. And therefore, when we're saying that our images are leaked, it's affecting me and my body, and therefore take action against that. I think that's currently a gap between researchers and policymakers and practitioners. And if we bridge that gap, it would sort of help us move forward and take this more seriously, I would think.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think that's a very vital point. And yeah, I mean, I think none of us do, we always think emotionally in terms of anytime you're violated online, when you're, we're only thinking of it as an emotional response to a violation, a bodily violation or an emotional violation, but never as data itself. And I think that will also put a real spin and accountability on the various online platforms, because that's the language they understand better than, the language of violence itself, but perpetrated on women's bodies. Thank you so much for that. Gopika, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, just a last thing, and listening to everyone makes me believe this even more, that I think we need to be doing much more interdisciplinary work. At Enough, we have, we do work with researchers, we work with a lot of feminist artists and collaborators. And what really happens in that environment is a lot of pushing against boundaries. And it really helps everyone sort of think about what is the larger goal. And so I would love to see much more sort of interdisciplinary work that brings together a lot of this thought that, campaigners are working on. And, not the end of everything isn't mainstreaming. So I think we also have to get out of that sort of, I think, mainstreaming is I've heard that word a lot. And I think we just need to be innovative and different. And if the government doesn't pick up, a campaign that we're doing, then we should just go and do it on our own. But when we have a great ally in the government who's going to take up some of the amazing norm shifting work that feminists are doing, and we've seen a lot of that in the last 20, 30 years, I think it's a lesson that we can learn from, in terms of not being afraid to be propositional about our feminist messaging, and to be more strong and bold about it. So yeah.
Thank you so much. I think there's a reason why we also wanted to get young dynamic people like you into the panel, the three of you today, because one of the things that we also realized is the problem is old, but the solutions need to be new, because the problem has been sort of festering in newer worlds as we speak, as we inhabit newer spaces. And therefore, as younger advocates and campaigners, what is the ground reality and what works and what doesn't, and what needs to be really turned on its head in a certain sense. And thank you so much for really bringing that a very important perspective. I think with that, I'll open the floor to some questions here. We have our own colleagues here who actually asked some questions, but I'll begin with Kopai Riti's question. What about trans women who earn living by begging during traffic in traffic signals? How do we provide a safe public space for them, is the question. Anybody wants to take that?
Radhika, you unmuted at the same time as me. I only have this to say, that I think we also have to think about the stereotypes we have of if we're talking about trans women specifically, that's not the only thing that trans women do. And I think also that's also a part of the kind of norms that we are creating. So I think when we talk about safe public spaces, it should be about how do we create inclusive spaces. And maybe there's a reason why trans women are forced into marginalized professions or forced into begging. And so let's ask ourselves a different question as to why do you feel that trans women are begging, and why is that the kind of picture that you have in your mind? So I just wanted to, I know that's probably not the answer to the question, but I guess the framing of what we're seeing should probably flip into public space and inclusivity, as opposed to public space and creating marginalizations and reinforcing
segregating spaces, really, right? And to create I totally agree with you. I don't know if that answers Kopai Riti's question, but that definitely is I think the idea is to reframe all of these notions and norms that pre-exist in our own conditionings. Somebody wants to add to that? Yes, Radhika, of course, please. Please do.
I mean, I completely agree with Gopika's response. I just wanted to build something on that. Of course, saying that being a cis woman myself, I'm not going to, sort of give any pointers to like how, trans women's lives should be regulated in these spaces. But if you just speak a little bit more broadly about people in public spaces at these, in these kinds of situations, speaking from, again, the digital perspective, there is like this fascination that the government currently has with using CCTVs and facial recognition and all kinds of technologies under the guise of keeping, women safe. So you have like the Nirbhaya Fund, which, has put up these CCTVs in a lot of metropolitan cities with the stated aim of keeping women safe. And so I really just wanted to bring that in here and say that in public spaces, the use of does not really actually translate to experiences of safety on the ground for a lot of people. What it does is, in fact, make people change their behavior. And I think safety should be something that, as Gopika also said, and as Thirupurasundari also said earlier in the webinar, something that makes the space itself safer, not something that people have to modify their behavior and actions for to obtain that level of safety. And I think that at that level, therefore, the current strategies that are being implemented to get the kind of safety in public spaces through CCTVs and other kinds of technologies, and a lot of money that's being pumped into those resources are not really going to achieve what is, quote unquote, women's safety at the end of the day. So I know that does not really specifically speak about trans women's experiences, but keeping in mind my own location, I just wanted to sort of broaden that out, and I hope that was okay.
Right. No, thank you so much. Thank you. Let me move on to the next question, if you don't mind. It's from Preeti Rao, one of our colleagues, as you know. So Preeti asks, when women move to a virtual space from public-private spaces, what are 4 or 5 key pointers that they should keep in mind to make sure that they transcend the space continuum comfortably?
If I can just very quickly go again. So I don't know if I can give like 4 or 5 like top key points, but there's one thing that I can probably share, which is that, there is a lot of pressure for women to respond to online violence in particular ways in the digital space that, and this is also seen in physical spaces, like women are always told, why didn't you file a police complaint? Why didn't you file an FIR? And that also happens online, people say, did you report this? Did you, why did you block them? There's a lot of pressure to behave in a particular way. And a lot of feminists and research shows that, for instance, women prefer to not opt for these kinds of legal measures in response to online violence. Like, I receive death threats and rape threats every day. If I had to take legal action against every single person who sent me these threats, I would just be exhausted. So I think we need to understand that justice means different things for different people, and what justice can mean for women in different situations is a very complex question. It's something that only a woman can decide for herself. When a woman is therefore going online and is putting up things online, I think that's something to remember, that you will face a lot of pressure to sort of conform and behave and respond in what are traditional ways of handling situations. They don't necessarily work in the online, because you're going to face like a lot of abuse, a lot more in that sort of capacity in these spaces, and therefore these same measures won't work. So just sort of go with that conviction that you do what you think is best for you, and unfortunately that's not the conviction the rest of the world moves with, but hopefully with more such conversations we'll catch up and move the discourse towards understanding that sort of subjectivity better.
Yeah. No, that's very true. I mean, there are, I don't think there are golden rules yet. And I think just by definition, the idea of rule, again, disciplines the female body and voice. And so to each their own. But at the same time, I think the larger question that Preeti, I think, was arriving at is, how do we make ourselves safer within these spaces, and how do we transcend in a smooth way? I mean, and this is still a very urban sort of access oriented elite problem, right? I mean, the idea of transcending from public spaces into a digital space, right? So I know that there are several digital spaces, regional sort of TikTok-ish, sites which are extremely violent against a woman. There's pornography, there's a lot of like boys locker room conversations happening there. So a woman is inviting violence upon herself, quote unquote, when she decides to get into, or even those dating apps. I know that there are so many young girls who come out feeling extremely violated, but so I think the mitigation of that space is something that I think we're all, I think at this point, grappling with in many ways, as a community, as a global community. The next question is from Soma KP. And this is not so much a question about today, but I think this is a larger question, but I'd really encourage any of our panelists to take this. The issue of unpaid work, I think one of us brought it up, is huge for rural women. I think Gopika was speaking about, that. And I would like the speakers to reflect on their conditions in situations of pandemic with economic strife and reinforced cultural values leading to increased captive labor of women within households and sex slavery of girls in Chitrakoot. That's a very specific question at the end, but the larger question may be.
I can briefly respond to that. I think, the issue of unpaid care work is very important. I can't speak to the specifics, but one thing I will say, and this is just also from my knowledge of interacting with campaigns that are currently working in the rural scenario, I think there are extremely nuanced kind of challenges that women are facing. Yesterday, Pari, which is the People's Archive for Rural India, actually posted a story on their page about rural women ASHA workers who are facing backlash. This particular woman was facing backlash from her in-laws. They had returned from Delhi and she was encouraging them to get tested for COVID-19. And they basically threw her out of the house and said, why are you accusing us of passing on infections to you? And so I think in terms of the identity of rural women also, I think we think of rural women as of course, the kind of work that is being done by women in rural areas is the way in which we sort of define women. But I think looking at those multiple identities of women is also important to understand the nuances of those who are working, who are facing the front line of what is happening in COVID-19, both within the homes and I think outside as well. So, but I just wanted to sort of bring out this aspect of, yes, the unpaid care work is a huge issue. Yes, domestic violence is a huge issue. Most Oxfam countries, even in South Asia now, are not even in the mind frame of doing campaigns of shifting norms. Everybody is just getting down to trying to figure out who is where and how and what is happening. So I think the aspect of outreach in rural areas is going to be one of the big challenges now, especially for organizations and movements who are going to have to work in this sort of restricted environment.
Thank you. The next question is from Ilamati. Says, great session. Thank you for all panelists. Thank you to all the panelists. Ms. Gopika, would you like to explain a little more on how asking men to share the workload in-house would reinforce patriarchy? Very specific.
Thank you for that question, because I actually really appreciate the honesty of people who actually want to delve further. I guess my message today was to say, it is fine to ask men to share the workload in the home. But as campaigners and public communications professionals, when we talk about sharing work at home, our responsibility is also to understand and to underlie our messages with how do we challenge patriarchy, not how do we ask men to help. So I think the onus is on not everyone in the community, but the onus is on those who are crafting the messages to ensure that when we're putting out campaigns that talk about the need to have equal work at home, is to highlight that it is everyone's right to have equality within the household, and that women shouldn't be subject to violence if they don't do housework. And I think making that connection is important. And what I was trying to say is, I am seeing a lot of public campaigns that champion men for that. So that is sort of the nuance of what I was trying to say, that let's not resort to championing men because that's the easiest thing to do, but let's sort of question the underlying messaging of, okay, can we put out messages that say that it is a woman's right to have rest at home, or it is a man's right to get up and do the dishes, and let's not pat him on the back too much because he already benefits from patriarchy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for taking that question and sort of further clarifying that. This is a question again from one of our colleagues, Archana Shekhar. So she says, when Thirupurasundari talked about the broken bridge in Chennai and the access to that space, and Gopika spoke about reimagining campaigns, I wonder how much work there is to do to unpack the idea of the perpetrator. This seems to be buried in stereotypes too. The man in a house, while in many cases it is the mother, we usually think it's the man of the house, but in many cases it's the mother that reinforces or extracts labor from young women. The other inbox online and in public spaces, the loud man from the marginalized community, etc. Any thoughts on that? I mean,
this particular point, I think, where are we handling the roots is, the point is to start from schools, gender sensitization, and making sure that the kids understand, like when we are talking to people who are 6 years and 5 years, we have 60 to 70 years for them to understand, and then they can carry it forward. I think there are to be solutions to be found, planning solutions and all that, but it should start from the education system. Gender sensitization should be an important part in that, because at the end of the day, it shouldn't be like, again, women, we need pointers, we need safe points to access. And one thing I loved what she spoke about digital spaces is blurring, it is us in the digital space, right? And also one more point which we were talking was about TikTok and Instagram. Even there is a cyber bias also. TikTok users are one set of users. Instagram users are looked at differently. I think that is also something which is there. But yeah, that was one point. And regarding Archana's point, yes, that there needs to be a lot of work done on that point of view. But starting from schools, that gender sensitization as a crux is the only way forward to make sure the problems are taken care of in the roots. Yeah. That's something I felt.
Right. Thank you. I mean, there are so many more questions just coming in, but I'll probably keep this as the last question in the interest of time. This is from Nicole Abraham. And the question is, the age spectrum of males involved in gender-based violence is widening. The crimes itself are getting harder to even read in news reports. How do you think our demographic dividend, that is a young population, can be arrested from becoming an uncontrollable problem?
I can just share my reflections on that. I think one of the things that, if we're talking about young people and how to engage young people, let's think about what went wrong in the way we are communicating about violence as well. So I'm just going to reflect on, okay, if we're saying older people, I'm not too sure about the data on how many people are perpetrating violence, but I think the answer is hidden somewhere in Archana's question as well. Until we address underlying patriarchy and intersectional identities of people, and we keep certain ideas and stereotypes of who perpetrators are, we won't be at the place where young men or young women or young gender diverse people can actually openly talk about what are some of the underlying stereotypes, attitudes, beliefs that exist. And unless we have a critical mass of young people who are really challenging those stereotypes, which are the underlying basis of what perpetrates violence, then I think we will not reach anywhere, and we will have the same sort of violence manifested in different ways in our current scenario. So I think let's not think of it as we're dealing with a different problem, but we're dealing with the same problem that's manifesting in different ways. And I think, Radhika brought out some of those nuances in terms of how we think about it, but ultimately it all boils down to the same thing. So we need to be thinking much deeper about what we're doing if we're trying to change things, and not necessarily like, how do we stop men from raping? Because I think once we start going down the how do we stop men from raping, then we'll end up into a place which is sort of, we're not able to come back from. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And, this is increasingly a feeling that I've had too, the sharp, sort of onus on the perpetrator on the one hand, and then the victim or the survivor on the other. There's a wide gap between these two people, several agencies that need to be held accountable, right? Including what Radhika was bringing up, if it's the digital space, or if what TS was saying about the public space, then there are several factors, several stakeholders whose accountability need to be questioned, even if it's, a case of, say, rape or any other form of violence, right? So I think that brings us to really, unfortunately for us, it's 6:30 on the clock, and this is a really important panel. I'll say why, because I think you are the people who are working on the ground, who are working with different developmental policies and advocacy programs, and really looking at what it is that we need to do as a community and as women ourselves, what it is that we need to do, and self-reflect to see how we on an everyday basis are part of this socializing and normalizing of gendered societies, right? I don't think any one of us are entirely above that. And so therefore it's a life's journey. And so in that process, how do we really help ourselves and colleagues and peers and other women? My mind goes back to what Foucault centuries ago said about punishing and disciplining the woman's body, the theory of power. Nothing much has changed since then, unfortunately for us. But this shifting paradigms within the society, a pandemic, I think increased awareness, at least among a certain class of people, to talk about gendered spaces and gender-based violence. I think all of this makes this time very ripe for us to reevaluate and reframe some of the ways in which we have tried to mitigate violence amidst us. Thank you so much, Gopika, Thirupurasundari, and Radhika for being who you are, and for being so dynamic and being part of this very important discourse in the larger society, and for agreeing to be with us on this panel today. I once again want to thank my very dynamic team of colleagues at Creed Leah who put this together. And with that, we come to the end of today's webinar. Thank you all to all the participants and audience who have asked some great questions. Lots to think about and move forward. Thank you all.